If we are planning on high output that continues to increase, how can we turn that high output into high opportunity? We need meaningful new demand to help with this rising domestic supply.
We'd like to start thinking about ethanol as more than just a liquid fuel. We want to think about it as a raw material.
Hello and welcome to the Cobcast, Inside the Grind with the National Corn Growers Association. This is where leaders, growers, and stakeholders in the corn industry can turn for big picture conversations about the state of the industry and its future. And today we're kicking off a new series for the podcast here, America's Crop for America's Future. As we count down to the 250th anniversary of the country's founding, we're going to celebrate corn's contributions and take a look ahead because we are growing the future right now. There's a lot to explore, so make sure that you're following this show in your favorite podcast app and sign up for the National Corn Growers Association newsletter at ncga.com. I'm Dusty Weiss, and today we are joined by NCGA Chief Economist Krista Swanson and Sean Arians, VP of Sustainable Production and Value Chain Engagement at NCGA. They're going to get us up to speed on the supply and demand picture, why it's time to think differently, and the demand opportunities that open up for U.S. corn and corn growers when we do. First of all, Krista, welcome back to the show. You've had a promotion since the last time that we had you on the Cobcast, but can you remind us a little bit about your background and what you do?
Yeah. Hi, Dusty. Glad to be back on the Cobcast. Yeah. So I am the chief economist for NCGA. And one of the best things about the promotion that you referenced is that we got to add another economist. So we've been able to expand the economic work that we're doing at NCGA, which is something that is so exciting to me.
Well, and of course, that stuff just a bigger and bigger part of the value that NCGA provides for its members year in and year out now, really helping position us for the future, which is going to be a big part of what we talk about today. But checking in with Sean real quick, because Sean, this is your first time with us here on the podcast, but you're coming up on your second anniversary at NCGA. Can you tell us a little bit about your role and your background prior to joining Corn?
Yeah, thanks, Dusty. And it's hard to believe it's been almost 2 years already. Joined from a number of industry roles, primarily in marketing and product support areas of John Deere dealerships through climate field view and precision planting. So that has been the majority of my background in startups and scale-ups. And when was presented the opportunity to get back into the sustainability space, it was quite exciting, just given the opportunities that exist as we think about market demands and how we continue to evolve as the corn industry to access some of the markets that have been longtime markets, but those rules are changing as the consumer demands change. So really excited to be here and get to work with a team of great individuals like Krista and also all of our action team leads who really look at every aspect of the corn industry and how we can make strong investments to provide more opportunities for America's corn farmers. And fortunately, I also have the opportunity to be a corn farmer, farm corn and soybeans in Northwest Illinois, actually just a little further north than Krista. So as a checkoff payer, it's been really insightful to understand how those pennies are invested to make dollars come back.
Absolutely. And I don't mean to throw you under the corn truck here or anything, Sean, but I was creeping on your LinkedIn profile before we got started here. Is it true that you are, in fact, licensed as an auctioneer in the great state of Illinois?
That is true.
He did our corn pack auction last year. So
yes, and will be again. So come join us.
Well, I'll tell you what, if we have an opportunity as we wind the show down here, I might invite you to do our end credits, Sean, just as a little bit of change of pace, because I think folks are tired of my voice doing that. But before we get to that, we are here to talk about corn and the future of corn. To get to that, we got to look back at the recent past and acknowledge another mammoth crop that U.S. corn growers harvested this fall. Krista, what do we need to know about the massive accomplishments of farmers production-wise in 2025?
Yeah, well, you already hit it when you called it a mammoth crop, I think, or a massive crop. One of the things I love to talk about with corn production and our ability in the U.S. to produce corn is in 2025, we planted 98.8 million acres of corn, which is the highest since the 1930s. And yet this year, our U.S. corn growers produced more than 7 times the amount of corn that they were growing in the 1930s and 20s on a very similar number of acres. I think that is so amazing. In 2025, corn yielded 186.5 bushels per acre, which was a record, but not just a record by a small amount. It was a pretty significant record yield, and we produced 17 billion bushels of corn. In the last few months of 2025, we were looking ahead to a crop with a 16 in front of it, 16 billion. And we then blew past that and got a 17 billion bushel corn crop. Again, a record, and not just a record by a small amount, but 11% over our previous record production. And so we're talking about a lot of corn that we need to find a place to go with. And so that's a lot of what we're working on here in this future of corn type of work that we're doing, is looking at this, what I would call a growing structural difference between supply and demand as this productivity story continues into the future.
I got to say, Krista, the only thing wilder than those numbers that you threw down just now is the reaction whenever you tell someone from farm country about those numbers, because they just kind of look at you and go, yep, a lot of corn this year. Do you get the sense that it's almost like table stakes now to have a record corn crop? I'm not trying to sell short the accomplishment, but I feel like in some circles, it would almost be bigger news if we didn't have a record corn crop.
Yeah, or maybe if we didn't have a record corn crop outside of some sort of weather or other type of scenario. I think one of the interesting things when you think about 2025 is the size of this crop that we produced, and knowing that both Iowa and Illinois had a notably lower yield than what the forecast for those two states was at one point. Growers in parts of both states faced some fungal challenges and some late season type of challenges. And, so what could it have been if it weren't for that? We could have been talking about a really, really big number.
18? Would 18 have been an ideal scenario there?
18 would have been too far out of the feasibility bucket for last year. But as we look ahead, so I'm glad you mentioned that, because I've been running some prospective type of scenarios looking at what corn production could be over the next decade. And in some of the long-term scenarios that USDA puts out, for example, they have this decline in corn acres every year and then this trend yield increase. And together, it results in a production number in 10 years that's pretty similar to what we just hit in 2025. So what I'm wanting to look at is, what happens if acres stay near the levels they were in 2025? What happens if maybe they don't stay that high consistently, but what if they're at 95 million corn acres over the next 10 years? What kind of production are we looking at in 2035 if we look 10 years out, if we talk about that? And we can easily hit 18 plus billion bushels of corn at that point if we're talking about factoring in the trend yield that we've seen consistently over the last century continuing, and a 95 million plus acre corn crop.
I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but that's really interesting that you say that USDA is forecasting a decline in corn acres. Why are they making that assumption? And do you think that that's an accurate assumption to make?
So it's kind of just their standard modeling practice. If you went back over the last, say, 15 years and looked at their 10-year projections in each of those years, it's just a consistent thing that they're doing as they're sort of normalizing, maybe you would say, crop acres across the crops. So I don't read too much into that, which is why I'm running different types of scenarios based on different assumptions. Plus, I think for the purposes of our work as we look ahead is we want to think on the high side and plan for greater supply and be prepared for what kind of demand opportunities could be out there to meet a potential higher supply.
Well, I mean, that's just it. I hate to say plan for the best, expect the worst, or plan for the worst, expect the best, depending on how you want to look at it. But it seems like yields at least are going to continue to go up, if not acreage as well, knowing that there's a whole lot of corn coming onto the market in the years ahead. What does that mean for farmers?
Yeah. So one of the things that we're working on is thinking about this challenge that I would say we have of like, if we are planning on high output that continues to increase, how can we turn that high output into high opportunity and increasing that opportunity for farmers as we think about that difference between supply and demand? We need meaningful new demand to help with this rising domestic supply, but also globally, we're looking at increasing corn production over time as we see other nations expanding corn acres. Here in the United States, we can talk about it being a high acres year, but the reality is we are adding new cropland acres at the extent that we're seeing in places like Brazil, for example. Like we have a fairly steady number of crop acres, and corn is going to only make up a certain number of those. But globally, we can be talking about not only increasing productivity in terms of yield, but also expanding land area. So again, how do we turn this increasing output into increasing opportunity?
Certainly, that's the supply side of things, and it doesn't seem likely that the corn supply is going to decline anytime here or abroad. But then that pushes us onto the demand side of things and how we can drive more corn demand. Sean, that's kind of your area of expertise here. What are we looking at?
Yeah, and Krista's done a great job of setting up this pile of corn that we need to think about. How do we use it differently? And one scenario is we've looked at this and tried to understand what has happened in the past that we can learn from and not hopefully be in the same scenario. So as we look at previous trade wars, specifically on the soybean side, in 2018, China represents about 30 to 40% of the demand at that time for U.S. soybeans. And according to USDA and some of the analysis that they have done, that was about $12.8 billion worth of soy to China in 2018 or prior to that trade war in 2018. And as they calculated, that's about a $9.4 billion loss in annualized losses to farmers as we think about the impact of thinking about one demand player in the market and relying very heavily on that. As we think about our ethanol space, ethanol is about 34%. And certainly between Krista and I, we can get into the numbers of how much is livestock versus ethanol versus new uses and other. So for the purpose of the conversation, we'll use roughly 34% of the corn demand. Fortunately, we've had a really strong year on exports of ethanol this year, and we've had high domestic utilization. For us, though, is we want to start shifting into what does America's crop do for America's future? We'd like to start thinking about ethanol as more than just a liquid fuel. We want to think about it as a raw material that can be used in the bioeconomy. So think anything that uses a petroleum base today, plastic bottles, and Lord knows America uses a lot of plastic. Then we also think about detergents and soaps that are also very heavily petroleum based. There is an opportunity, and we are working on some of these right now, for ethanol to be a drop-in replacement for that fossil fuel and really come out the other side of that process as an ingredient to be used in a number of those production methods. And that really gives us this breadth of opportunity to create some demand that doesn't just rely on our traditional thought of liquid fuel consumption. And of course, as we think about that, we know there are headwinds in the space. And part of what we often hear is, well, electric vehicles are really impacting liquid fuel consumption. Yes, electric vehicle consumption or utilization has increased. The reality of it is, though, as we look at some of the studies that have been done, fuel efficiency of vehicles has actually caused more of a reduction in liquid fuel consumption than electric vehicles have. So we just have a lot of headwinds as we think about liquid fuel consumption in the United States and abroad that we want to really broaden our aperture and think about how can we take this snapshot in time, learn from what we've done, all the great successes, and really paving the way for the future of America's crop.
You know, Sean, we did an episode a few back here where we covered one of the big winners of the Consider Corn Challenge, and that's a company that's using corn feedstock to make the kinds of air filters that you put into your furnace. And I thought that was the neatest darn thing. A, because I didn't know that those filters were made out of petroleum products. But B, if I can replace a petroleum product that's filtering the air that runs through my house with something that's grown in my neighbor's field, I'm going to do that 10 times out of 10 here. How do you start shifting the conversation, though, for people that are in their habit of, well, I'm going to buy the same air filter at the store. I'm going to buy the same plastic bottle at the store. Or, when I fuel up at the gas station, well, I'm used to doing this one over here and using the 10% ethanol blend. How do you get consumers to really take an interest in supporting America's crop?
That's a loaded question, Dusty.
They don't bring me on to ask the easy questions here, Sean, but it's something that seems like a no-brainer to folks like you and me and Krista and the folks who are listening. But outside of farm country, I just don't hear that conversation happening.
Yeah, we often take for granted, I think, how our products are made that we consume every day as we think about the consumer packaged good or just the consumer goods segment. And often we've just been blindsided by this bucket of accessible markets like ethanol to blend for octane. The reality is, as Krista and I and the team have dug into this, the bioeconomy can actually utilize more ethanol than what we're producing today for liquid fuel consumption. So part of our responsibility as an organization to invest checkoff dollars is programs like the Consider Corn Challenge and Radical, and getting companies like Airterra in front of not only our members, but find ways to help them fast forward their work and their progress. And admittedly, while that corn-based air filter doesn't use a ton of corn per each, so if you're currently replacing your air filters every 45 days, you should probably go to every 30, Dusty, and that would help use more corn. However, those filters, are just one example of creating a consumer market that is massive when we think about how many American consumers are there that have a need for an air filter. Those are the types of things that we will need multiple wins. And as Krista rolled this out last week, we talked about silver bullets and the lack of really being one silver bullet. We need a lot of hits like the air filters, like ethanol, like thinking about detergent replacements or plastic bottle or plastic goods. Those are all multiple avenues that can help us get where we need to go, because it's not just going to be one thing that solves this pile of corn problem that we've got.
I can add to that, January, when we had our grower action teams together, there was a presentation from the Plant-Based Products Council, who's done some survey work of consumers, like asking questions about their interests, their knowledge of products that are plant-based, like corn. And, I think that some of their survey data shows that consumers are interested in these products, especially as we see a growing sustainability-driven mindset. And to Sean's point, this is not going to be an easy task. But the good news is that when we think about some of these potential products, like the corn-based air filters, like clothing for activewear or plastic bottles, like these are products that a lot of consumers are buying and wearing and using, and they're things that they continue to need more of. And so I think those are promising when we think about how do we reach that consumer market.
Corn-based yoga pants has got me spinning in my head here all of a sudden, because, wow, that would be a game changer. Certainly seems to be a case of just getting the right people in the room, talking to them and helping them see the benefit of something that's grown in the ground instead of pumped out of the ground. But we have an opportunity that seems to be right in front of us right now to just blend more ethanol into gasoline. Where is that at right now, and what hopes can we pin on that for the future of corn demand?
Yeah, E15 remains a top priority right now for National Corn Growers Association. It's something that we are still advocating very strongly to get into must-pass legislation this year. I'm viewing it as the single fastest way to generate more use for corn in the short run, because it's a whole infrastructure and system that's already set up and we're already using ethanol in on-road use. And so that is and continues to be a huge priority for our organization. But Sean was talking about some of the long run demand opportunities that are out there that are growing market segments with major market potential. And as we look at the reality of on road motor gasoline use, and he hit on this a little bit, but you look out over the long run, and the Energy Information Administration puts out this forecast that goes through 2050. And the reality is, in their baseline scenario, we're talking about a 40% drop by 2050. Even in their best case scenario, it's a 17% drop by 2050. So that means that as we look over future decades, we're talking about potentially higher blends, which would be great for the time being, but ultimately it's a higher blend of a declining market segment. And so the awesome news here is that the future of ethanol is bigger than on-road gasoline. Sean talked about that. We have the bio-based product economy and things like maritime that provide market potential that is bigger and potentially growing segments.
And I would add too, is we think about the history of ethanol, and we actually leveraged timeline from RFA on their website. But the first ethanol was developed in 1826. And here we are almost 200 years later, celebrating last year, the 20th anniversary of the Renewable Fuel Standard. All of these new things, Krista mentioned maritime, which is a pretty easy kind of segue to get into that market. Sustainable aviation fuel is another thing that we're working on. And we'll actually be hosting a meeting with airlines and other industry stakeholders around Commodity Classic. Those are all things that take time. And when we look at the history of ethanol, it took almost 148 years from that first use of ethanol to actually have the first piece of legislation to help encourage the adoption of that product. And then we think about 200 years. We don't have 200 years to create the future. All of these things that Krista and I have talked about are going to require us, at least some of it, to evaluate the policy changes that are needed so we can start to work through those with, be it EPA or the Department of Energy or USDA or all the above. And that takes time. So that's where we have to start now to really get the pavement laid for us to be able to be successful in what this next wave of utilizing ethanol as a raw material might be, and get us set up for success as we look to the future.
Speaking of centuries of history here, we mentioned at the jump that corn is certainly tied deeply into our nation's history. And I think there's a lot of recognition of that in the farming and agribusiness communities, but maybe not so much among the general population. So as we launch into the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence here, do we see an opportunity to sort of pump up corn a little bit in the general population's minds?
Yes, I think that there is opportunity to pump up corn in the minds of the nation. I think that's a lot of what our goal is with this America's Crop for America's Future, is reflecting on the fact that corn has been here for all of America's 250 years. And we want to ensure that America's family farmers can continue to grow corn for the next 250 years as we look ahead to America's future. And so I think that talking about some of these things like those workout pants made from corn, and thinking about some of those opportunities that are out there, and just helping people learn more about what is in some of these products that they use, and that we could be using corn grown by America's family farmers, a renewable and biodegradable product.
Yeah, and I would echo a lot of that. The opportunity as we think about educating and bringing people along on this journey of plant-based versus what's traditionally known as a fossil-based solution that so many of us use without giving it a second thought. We will continue to have this food versus fuel debate. However, as Krista set up early on, we're producing more on less land every year. And as we look at the competitiveness of the farmland by way of just being used for wind farms, solar farms, and urban sprawl, with more people building and taking land out of production, we continue to grow more. And people often ask, well, where do the extra corn acres that Krista alluded to come from? Think about other crops not being produced, like cotton or peanuts or some of those other commodities. Those acres are getting shifted to corn, and we continue to have more corn production. And that's kind of where that acre shift comes from. That often gets glossed over, I think, even internally in the ag industry, of how do we do this? And that's important as we think about engaging consumers to understand we're not consuming number 2 yellow corn as a human. We are consuming the proteins that are being fed number 2 yellow corn. We just have a lot of opportunities here, I think, as we both have talked about, finding these new uses that can be consumable in different ways that keep us on the path of productivity and profitability and benefiting the rest of America as we think about America's future.
As we look to the next 250 years of American agriculture, starting with Krista, I guess, what are you feeling optimistic about? What makes you feel good to be where we're at right now?
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes me feel good about where we're at are some of these demand opportunities that we're talking about. I get excited thinking about the potential markets that are out there. But the other piece of this is knowing, as a farmer myself as well, knowing that there are forward-thinking thought leaders at organizations like NCGA that are already thinking about these things and trying to work on behalf of America's farmers to position corn and other agricultural products for the future.
Yeah, well said, Krista. And I would add to that of just understanding the investments in the complexity of the space that I certainly didn't appreciate until I joined the corn team here, of not only our team in DC that loves, thankfully, the policy and regulatory side of understanding how do we take the technical expertise of our team, generally based here in Chesterfield and remote. How do we take some of those ideas and put them into either policy or regulatory positions that we can then take to the Hill to advance the efforts? And that's what really excites me about just the depth of knowledge and the heart of the team to really take the Hill on a number of these issues to ensure that farmers have the freedom to operate so that the family farm can remain the family farm and that we get to do what we enjoy every day.
As we head into this big year for the country, certainly something that we could take to heart there as we head back out to the farm fields for planting in the spring. But NCGA Chief Economist Krista Swanson and Sean Arians, VP of Sustainable Production and Value Chain Engagement at NCGA, thank you both so much for joining us here on the Cobcast.
Thanks for having us, Dusty.
Thanks, Dusty.
And Sean, you want to auctioneer us on the outro here?
Well, sure. I guess if we do our jobs, the corn prices will go from $4 now, quarter now, $4.25, bid them at $4.35 now, $45, bid them at $4.50, bid them at $4.75 now, $5 now, $5.25, $5.50. Let's go to $6, all the way to $6, now $7.
That was worth the price of admission. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. That was awesome. And thank you for listening. We hope you'll join us again next month for another episode of the Cobcast, Inside the Grind with the National Corn Growers Association. If you're on X, you can follow @NationalCorn for more news and updates from NCGA. Visit ncga.com to sign up for the association's email newsletter and make sure you're following this show in your favorite podcast app. The Cobcast is brought to you by the National Corn Growers Association with editing by Matt Covarrubias, and it's produced by PodCamp Media, branded podcast production for businesses, podcampmedia.com. For the National Corn Growers Association, I'm Dusty Weiss.